So, basically I learned a lot of things that rang true about myself, and things that filled me with a desire to learn more, learn as much as possible, basically about myself, because that's what drives most people's interest in socionics in the first place. To learn about yourself, and then after that, perhaps, about other types, how you can build relationships with other types, how you can find the personal relationship that you've been dreaming of, and so forth. And he also gave a description of my ex-girlfriend, essentially, and a description of our relationship. Now, I suppose I was lucky because he turned out to type both of us correctly, as I would later decide. And the description he gave of her and of our relationship was extremely accurate. Of course, there were little things that maybe weren't perfect, but all in all, it was a very good and perceptive description that actually was kind of astounding, considering that all the material he had to type her were some photos, just a few. And of course, with me, he had more information. He had a 5-hour meeting, and then a set of photos that I gave him. But it's still quite astounding. And that kind of got me hooked right from the very beginning. And that was the beginning of my interest in socionics, which was extremely strong for maybe 2 or 3 years in particular, where I internalized things to a great degree, studied other people carefully. One of the first things I did was I got a hold of, basically, these are the collected works of Aušra Augustinavičiūtė, who is the Lithuanian founder of socionics. And these books, or these collections of her essays, her monographs, I consider by far the best and most useful socionics literature. At least for me, because they lay out the basic ideas most clearly, perceptively, and broadly. Now, some of the things she's written have over time been kind of rejected, maybe debunked, modified, etc. But all in all, her treatment of the general ideas and principles of socionics is by far the best. So I read these, internalized it. I had to go back to the States and spend a year there finishing my studies. But then after that, I returned to Ukraine, where I spent 7 years in a row living after that. And I became active in the local socionics community. Now, that's a topic probably for another video, but in that time I became well acquainted with socionics as a community, with socionics literature. I didn't read everything there was to read on the subject because it quickly became obvious that authors repeated things that other authors had written, that basically each author felt it was his duty to introduce a whole new set of terminology, which makes things complicated. And yet, there were very few new ideas introduced by different authors. So there's a lot of new terminology, a lot of mixing ideas around, creating a new dichotomy, perhaps new descriptions of the same old dichotomies, etc. But really no new ideas to speak of, and certainly no new data. And since then I've basically come to the conclusion that during the past 30 years that socionics has existed basically in its current state, there's been a tremendous amount of mental reflection and logical thought on the subject of socionics' basic ideas, and on the subject of socionics types, functions, model A, other dichotomies, and so forth, but actually very little growth in the foundational data of the field. In other words, someone learning socionics today has a lot more books to read, and this is just a tiny collection of available books on socionics. They have a lot more books to read, but the essential things they have to learn are exactly the same as they were 30 years ago. And all these books will really not help them any more than the information that was available 30 years ago. So, after a few years after first learning of socionics, I basically resolved the personal issues that had gotten me interested in socionics in the first place, which are things like personal development, choosing my path in life, finding myself, my personal philosophy, and of course learning to build intimate relationships with other people, with the opposite sex, and to some degree learning to build productive friendships with other people. So those were the basic tasks that I resolved within a couple of years. I continued to study and discuss socionics actively with friends, but starting about 4 years ago, this process has been going steadily downhill. And I've been more and more skeptical of things that perhaps in the past I used to take for granted or find interest in trying to take apart and understand. Now, learning about socionics typically involves two parallel processes. Studying the theory, studying all these books, articles, Wikisocion if you're in the English-speaking world, online forums, etc. And then the application of ideas. Now, if you have access to a lot of literature, now, if you're in the Russian-speaking world, obviously there's a ton more literature to read. And this is just a tiny part. There are papers, there are journals that are published with studies, so-called studies on socionics, which basically are usually just more mental masturbation rather than scientific studies as we typically think of them. So if you focus on reading the literature, it may seem that things are quite complicated. There's a ton to learn, all this terminology. You've got to learn, author X's ideas, author Y's ideas, author Z's ideas, figure out where their differences and commonalities lie, etc. It really can seem a lot more complicated than it really is. But what is socionics about in practice? Really, it's just about 16 types and 16 relationships between these types. That's all. Of course, there are lots of other ideas that explain why these 16 types exist, why there are 16, why there are 16 relationships, the theoretical constructs behind these relationships.